In football now, there's more diving than the Olympics, but it wasn't always like this. Back in the good old days, the only time you'd hit the ground was because their centre-back had just gone through, flying in, studs up, with about as much desire to get the ball as Ronaldo has to track back. So when did diving start to become a thing? When are players most likely to get a flop on? And what is the worst or best, depending on your point of view, dive of all time? We'll see later, but now, let's dive in. The entire game is built on influence peddling corruption. This is what one-man wind-up machine Sergio Ramos said in 2012 about football, but that couldn't be further from how it started. Modern football as we know it today was set up back in the 19th century by the British as a gentleman's sport. The idea of fooling the referee would have been seen as just not cricket. And not just because they weren't playing cricket. But thankfully for people who like to watch good quality football, the game isn't just played in England. Other countries' attitudes have been different over the years. Italian Gianluca Vialli once wrote, "When an opponent won a penalty against us by diving or making a meal of slight contact, the attitude among players and coaches wasn't to condemn him for cheating, but to point the finger at our own defenders for allowing it to happen." This difference in attitudes from country to country might help to explain why the first high-profile dive came from the land of sausage and lederhosen. In the 1974 World Cup, the Netherlands lit up the tournament with their brand of total football. When they met Germany in the final, it was a tight game, and one that would be decided by one of the first recorded dives ever, which we'll look at in a second.
He took a dive!
But it's worth mentioning that photographer, web designer, and man with a lot of time on his hands, Dick van Mersbergen, has created a diving hall of shame, a database with a total of 231 dives across decades. The first one, courtesy of Leeds United's Billy Bremner, has its sources from the brilliant movie The Damned United, so isn't the most reliable entry. So we're going to take the one above as the first dive, and that's from Bernd Holzenbein. Holzenbein's tumble in the box drew a penalty, which let the Germans cancel out a 1-goal lead for the Dutch, and the Party Poopers eventually won the game 2-1 to snatch the World Cup away from the best team in the tournament. Not content with one sneaky fall, 16 years later, with typical ruthless efficiency, they'd be at it again. Diarrhea enthusiast Gary Lineker once said, "Football is a simple game. 22 men chase a ball for 90 minutes and in the end, the Germans always win." Because back in those days, they always found a way to win, even if that was by what some might say, making the most of their opportunities, and others would say, cheating. Germany is known for its productivity and quality, and this was on show in the World Cup final of Italia 90, just not so much for the football as it was leaning towards a triple pike somersault. There was not one but two moments of acting the National Theatre would have been proud of in this tightest of games that made neutrals around the globe want to throw their TVs in the bin. If only they'd fit in one. Klinsmann's dive in this match is the one that's often remembered. He's vaulting over defender Pedro Monzon, and the impressive mock seizure he appears to have afterwards would then lead to Monzon being sent off and the Argentinians with a mountain to climb. The world had no choice but to award Klinsmann with a 9 for this well-executed twist. Rudi Völler was more subtle, with his decisive effort. But if there was an award for the perfect dive, it would have been this. If there was an award for the most flammable hair, he would have also won that as well. The propulsion of the fall correctly measured and natural looking, the situation neutral, the falling not too camp, and most importantly, the whole thing was in the box. It was a fall that even with today's ability to put the footage on an instant replay loop, you still can't fully tell what had happened. You almost get gaslighted by how good the dive was that you actually feel like the player might have been honest. Before you snap out of it and remember, nope, he conned the ref in the same way that his barber conned him into thinking his hair would have been a good idea. The outcome of all this was a crucial penalty converted to win the World Cup, and a reputation for Klinsmann that would follow him to the Premier League and lead him to reclaiming the slurs he faced on the terraces by performing this celebration to be copied by children up and down the country in the 90s, to the despair of mums fearing the dad's doorstep challenge. It also had a cultural impact in Holland. Soon after Völler did his best impression of a mannequin being thrown out of a shop window, it became known in Holland as the Holzenbein Schwab. Schwab, excuse the pronunciation, is German for swallow, the small bird, not what your mum does, because apparently swallows drop quickly while flying. Schwab in Holland has definitely caught on as much as diving has in the game. A quick search of De Telegraaf, the biggest newspaper in Dutchland, comes back with dozens of Schwab references. Then again, the editor might just have been a massive swallow fan, and if he's watching, please don't take that the wrong way. These two massive dives would open up the floodgates for the whole world to join in with tricking the referee, and the dives were only going to get more ridiculous. I'll be looking at some of the worst soon. Before we jump headfirst into the Hall of Shame, the dive has become such a massive part of modern football that scientists have, believe it or not, studied it. In 2012, the University of Queensland researched dives and came up with some interesting, if fairly obvious conclusions. Taxpayers' money well spent. For the work, lead author Gwendolyn David, a PhD student, analysed falls from 60 games. 10 each from the Spanish, German, Dutch, Italian, French and Australian leagues to determine whether or not they were dives. Presumably, the Premier League was omitted because it was just too honest. Or more likely, they didn't have a Sky subscription. She was a student, after all. The falls were then classed as legitimate, slightly deceptive, where the player was touched by an opponent but they exaggerated the impact, aka Neymar, or highly deceptive, aka Neymar. They then looked at where they'd gone down and at what point in the game. Only 6% were dives, and on average, 33% of dives were rewarded by the referee with a penalty. Unsurprisingly, the results showed that players are more likely to go full sniper victim when a game is drawn and they're near the attacking end, in the hopes of securing a penalty. Like I said, taxpayers' money well spent. So now it's been proven where and when we're most likely to see dives, which ones are the worst, and who is the worst offender. And seeing as it's such a problem, what are football's people at the top doing to try and stop it? But now, it's time for the diving Oscars. Our first nomination is for Rivaldo. When he took a tumble during the 2002 World Cup, the dive had started to creep into the game more and more frequently, with ever-growing theatrics. One thing that helped with this was the introduction of the red card for any player that touched another player's head. The Brazilian midfielder attempted to exploit this when Hakan Ünsal kicked the ball at him. Rivaldo grabbed his face like a parent playing peekaboo with their child, and Ünsal was given a second yellow and sent off. This started a trend for any player that gets so much as a caress against the face, going down like they've been paralysed by a taser. Our second nomination is for Blackburn's Morten Gamst Pedersen. If Rudi Voller's dive was subtle and clever, then Pedersen's dive was obvious and stupid. Alan Shearer said on Match of the Day in 2009 that it was the worst dive I've ever seen in my life. The player was ridiculed across the board, which prompted the Norwegian to come out and defend himself through a list of excuses reminiscent of someone who's definitely done something wrong. Let's count how many of these excuses he gets through in this genuine quote. There are other angles and things to consider. I was clipped. I lost my balance. My left calf hit my right calf, and when I put my hands up, it was more in frustration. If I got a better ball, I could have gone alone against the goalkeeper. We were 2-0 down. They scored on the counter-attack. I feel something and go down. It's a mix of being frustrated and tired. I'm not famous for cheating. You get a lot of players who do much worse. At least he did admit one thing. I've seen it from different angles, and it looks stupid from one of the angles, as if I just fell down. Correct, Morten. Next up to try and claim the Oscar is Ronaldo. It's no secret that Ronnie likes to take a tumble, and back in his early career in 2009, this was definitely the case. Contender of the GOAT of football looked more like a salmon here, as he didn't want to risk the chance of his hair getting messed up. The dive is so ridiculous that Frank Lampard is left with no option but to laugh in Cristiano's face, because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. Sergio Busquets is our next nominee and clearly studied at Rivaldo's circus school. He might have been one of the most talented midfielders of his era, but the Spaniard didn't cover himself in glory for this one. He gets brushed in the face by an Inter player who isn't even facing him and instantly collapses in a heap. But that's not the worst part. As he's rolling about in agony on the floor, he has a little sneak peek for his fingers to see what's going on around him. Annoyingly, it worked. The referee decided Thiago Motta deserved a red card for this. But Inter got the last laugh as they went on to put Barca out of the Champions League and win the final. Our final nominee is worth waiting for. This performance was one for the ages. Daniel Day-Lewis has got nothing on Cole Lafferty here. The Rangers player, presumably bored from the standard of Scottish football, leans into his opponent, brushes his head against his, and then takes a spectacular tumble. Amazingly, the ref sent off the Aberdeen player here, because I guess it's now an offence to look like you're about to kiss a player. Thankfully, this wrong was put right when Lafferty was given a retrospective 2-month ban. I'll be looking at these kinds of bans and other ways football associations are not dealing with diving a bit later, but now it's time to choose our winner. The Oscar for the best dive of all time goes to Morten Gamst Pedersen. This is because it's widely considered in footballing circles to be the most ridiculous tumble ever seen in the game, and I can't argue with that. But there's still plenty of time for someone to take his crown. There's certainly players all over the world still attempting to get themselves a well-deserved nomination. So despite everyone in the game fully aware that diving is an issue, what's being done about it?
I don't know.
In 2009, a significant milestone happened in the history of diving. A player was actually charged after the fact. UEFA made the decision to ban Arsenal forward Eduardo da Silva for a dive during a Champions League qualifier against Celtic. Of course, Arsene Wenger said,
I haven't seen it.
But it got his team a penalty. Wenger wasn't happy and claimed it singled out Eduardo as a cheat. something which UEFA would be unable to prove, although looking at it with your actual eyes helps. The ban was subsequently overturned on appeal for some reason, but this opened up the idea of retrospective punishment. Under the International Football Association Board Lords of the Game, Law 12, fouls and misconduct, a player can be cautioned for unsporting behaviour if they attempt to deceive the referee, e.g. by feigning injury or pretending to have been fouled, simulation. So leagues should be seeing more disappointing yellow than a Brazilian home World Cup, right? See, problem is that back in 2015-16, stats showed that only 1.89% of yellow cards were issued for simulation. Now this could be because players aren't doing all that much diving, but I think we all know that's about as likely as Luis Suarez's dentist putting a finger in his mouth. Scotland, as well as being early adopters of eating things out of animal stomachs, were also early adopters of the retrospective ban to help out with the officials who didn't spot were cheating on the field. On top of the Lafferty incident we looked at earlier, in 2011, fellow Rangers player Sonny Aluko was banned for 2 games for simulation by the Scottish FA. Former referee Kenny Clark, when he saw it, said that while there was contact, it was not enough to cause a man to spill a pint at a pub, far less to fall over. Unlike the Eduardo incident, an appeal was to no avail and the ban stood. Shockingly, it took until 2017 until England followed suit, and this was after a presumably humbling and confusing experience when FA officials visited their Scottish equivalents to see what they'd done right. In England, starting in the summer of 2017, a 3-man panel consisting of a former player, a former manager, and a former match official started reviewing video evidence on the Monday after games, as if Monday mornings aren't bad enough. If a player is found guilty, they get a 2-game ban. In November of the same year, Bristol City player Bailey Wright became the first player to be banned for 2 matches for diving while playing a championship game against Fulham, and Kamara's red card was rescinded. If only he'd saved his conning for the previous season, he would have got away with it if it wasn't for the pesky FA. That's the history of diving, but have a look at my video on how football has changed in general over the years, looking at tackles, kits, tactics, money and other stuff. Thanks.